I really appreciate the invitation to be here, and I'm not really sure why I'm talking, and I want to talk not very much because I'm much more interested in listening to all of you, but I thought I'd just present the flavor of a few of the kinds of problems we're working on, which aren't exactly mapping one-to-one onto what you would consider population structure, but all the same, the kinds of problems we work on, and a lot of people do, are relating some kind of signal variation to an external variable, whether it be genetic, geographic, or behavioral. So I used to work with frogs, and I started working with insects, which for frog people is the dark side. And there are lots of insects, and there are an incredible number of insects on plants. And so there's all these ecological interactions going on out there really are the result of millions and millions of individual behavioral decisions. And a lot of those decisions, whether it's predation or mutualism or parasitism out there that are taking place in that insect community on plants, are taking place through the medium of mechanical waves transmitted through plants. And this is also true for a lot of those social interactions among plant-dwelling insects. And I will just give you the flavor of a few of these vibrational soundscapes. I don't know if you can hear that. I should probably, they're so lovely, we should, well, you'll just have to listen closely. But we have a lot in common with the marine mammal folks because we have these complex soundscapes, but mostly we can't see what's producing them. And they're, although rather than occupying an entire ocean basin, they're often an individual soundscape is just a clump of grass. But those could sort of be pinnipeds or something. But if we wanted to describe these vibrational soundscape, one problem we have is we really don't know who's singing. For the vast majority of insects that communicate using plant-borne vibrations, which is really millions of species, most have never been recorded, let alone studied. So it's an example of one. A neat little signal, but my colleague Carl Gerhardt, who videoed this, was the first person to ever hear that species signal, and I could just see his hair standing up when he heard that. But we're just beginning to learn who's singing, and most of the time we don't know. So one problem is we have these complex soundscapes where we have a lot of species signaling and we don't know what they are. So if we want to characterize variation according to habitat or host plant or time of day, that's a problem. Another kind of signal variation that we try to relate to another output variable is behavior. And plants these are complex soundscapes not just because there are a lot of species signaling and their calls are somewhat complicated, but because plants transform those signals greatly as they travel through the plant. And so a plant stem, it vibrates like a guitar string. It twirls around, but at lots of frequencies. So one of the things, for example, that we might want to do is relate this variation to behavioral decisions. So here's an example of a search that's taking place by this insect, a male treehopper, finding a female and they're signaling back and forth, and here are spots where the male stops and they exchange signals, and he makes a decision to go forward or back and move a certain distance and signal again and signal again. We can then my grad student, Jeremy Gibson, record at each of these spots, record those signal exchanges, and then look at, this is the sensory input that guided that behavioral output. We have that behavioral output, which is, again, forward or back, and a distance that you move till you stop and sample again. And we can then extract the number of features from these signals using standard spectrogram or various aspects of the whirling motion of those stems, and then try to relate this signal variation to these behavioral variables to get at that kind of action perception cycle that's guiding behavior. And one of the things I'm trying to do in my research more and more is move away from user-defined measurements, and I've made so many of those. And when I started, I was using the original case sonograph that burns the spectrogram into the paper, and you measure that. And so we've done this, but this study, for example, is still done using user-defined measurements where we had to throw away a lot of the information that's present. And I have done some things like using a spectrogram as a predictor in a regression, but again, that requires a lot of pre-processing. This is probably the thing that really led me, you might say, drove me to be excited about the opportunity to come to this conference, which is we've also been trying to understand the decision-making process of periodical cicadas that come up by the billions after they're 13 or 17 years in the soil. And this is the part that we see. They come up and they molt and they spend a few weeks as adults. But before that happens, in the spring that they've decided to emerge, and we're not really working on that 13 versus 17 year issue, just in that spring, when do they decide to emerge? And they dig a tunnel almost to the surface, and then they spend about 6 weeks in there waiting. And then at some point, they'll all begin that mass migration out of the soil. And it clearly has a lot to do with temperature, but there also are a huge number of social cues. So we've tried to get at this by putting out an array of vibration sensors in the soil. And as soon as you go 10 centimeters into the soil, I think about this as like dropping a hydrophone into the Marianas Trench, because you don't know what you're hearing. But we have these, and so here's one configuration where we have 16 vibration sensors, and they're recording 24/7. And those of you who work with these data sets, I can sort of see the wince, right? Because in one day, you get 16 days worth. And then after one season, you have a year's worth. And then we have multiple years worth now of acoustic data from the soil. And we hope to be able to use this to predict what these insects are going to do. And we have, we're still working on, we've done various ways to try to look at their behavior. But here's a transect, and it's got vibration sensors all along there. And ideally, we'd like to be able to relate some of these signals that we're recording and take into account variations like temperature variation over time to figure out when the individuals are emerging. But there are a number of problems. One is that the data sets are very large. The other is that their signals, or the incidental cues often are things like digging or movement, which aren't maybe as stereotyped as signals. So that's another kind of class of problems, is how do we take acoustic signals that are somewhat incidental and may not be quite as stereotyped as signals, and use those to extract information from those. And their signals are not very distinctive. They produce some little signals. We think they're signals at least. They sound like a raindrop hitting the soil. And here, for those of you who can see it, here's an example of a little bit more better resolved spatial data. There are 2,000 dots on the screen. This is 3 meters by 4 meters. These are insects that came up in a little plot near Kansa Prairie in Kansas. They're color-coded, so all the ones with the same color came out on the same day. These are individual emergences of individual insects. So we're hoping to try to put together that temperature variation, acoustic variation, and these behavioral decisions. And I'll just mention lastly another example. So I spent a lot of time listening to and analyzing and recording these mechanical signals traveling through plants, but plants are rife with mechanoreceptors, and they're actually quite sensitive at detecting mechanical cues. And so I worked with a chemical ecologist colleague, and we wondered, well, could the plant be paying attention to some of this information that's going through them? And well, there's that. Again, we're looking at incidental kinds of signals, feeding vibrations, which just sound like to me they now sound kind of peaceful, like a sheep munching in a meadow. But we have things that are not meant as signals, but that the plant has to detect from this whole very complex vibrational soundscape. So that's another kind of problem we'd like to be able to approach is, well, how do we take these incidental vibrations and figure out, well, what should the plants be using to detect herbivore activity from benign kinds of vibrations or even positive kinds of vibrations like the ones that you guys are working with the pollinators, so that we can zero in on, well, how do we test and see what plants might have evolved to detect. So I will stop there And I'm happy to turn this over to the next speaker.